Okay.
Yeah, it's slowing down.
Looks like we have critical mass, and looks like our few people coming in still, but not too many. So thank you all for joining. I know many of you were on yesterday's meeting, and some of you were on a subgroup meeting we just had prior to this. So really appreciate everyone who's putting so much time into this. We know this is not an easy thing. It's taken a lot of time, and just want to thank you all for your commitment. So today we're going to continue on with considering proposals. We have 4 proposals on the agenda. It's a little bit ambitious, but want to get as far as we can. If we spend about 30 minutes per proposal, we can get there. So I just want to sort of plant that thought in people's minds. So there's not a whole lot of other business to talk about before we jump into the other proposals. I do want to note, as was listed in the email, that the 4 co-chairs are still working through the important issues of organizational representation and how we're going to handle voting. To be honest, we had some challenges over the past couple of weeks. We had one co-chair on a well-deserved vacation. We had another co-chair that was not well, and we just simply were not able to get the 4 of us together to deal with those issues. But we are committed to do that. We know it's important, and we will do everything in our power to have clarity on that as soon as possible. Also want to note that prior to this meeting, we had a subgroup meet to discuss regulations as they pertain to our public forest lands. If you recall, previous meeting 2 weeks ago, we had a proposal related to regulations on our public forest lands, and we kind of tabled that and agreed that we needed to first establish more kind of a common understanding about what the current regulations are that apply to our public lands before we can consider that proposal. And we have a couple of other proposals that are in that vein. So we've now kicked that whole discussion to a subgroup. I thought we had a really good discussion. There was a lot of information sharing, just kind of level setting. We're working on getting a representative from DEP to join us for that next subgroup meeting. There were a number of questions that we feel like we need to get clarity on from DEP. And the hope is that that subgroup is going to be able to kind of talk through some of these proposals related to regulations, and then eventually come back to the full work group, maybe having made some progress towards identifying some consensus items or not. And we'll see how it goes. So there's that separate conversation happening at the subgroup level. Let's see. Eileen has noted that in terms of directing questions for the chat today, you should send them to Allison Schmeider, our amazing intern, and so she'll be able to then share them with all 4 of the co-chairs. So I think that's it as far as like business. Eileen, Anjali, Andy, anything else sort of before we dive into proposals that you want to flag?
No, just that I hope to hear discussion from many participants. I know some of you have been listening in the background, and we certainly want to hear from everyone. So as we hear the proposal sponsors present their ideas, we hope to hear from everyone.
Yeah, we definitely encourage all voices. Some people have been quieter than others, so there's an open invitation to share your views. The other thing I would just encourage people is to really try to make a little bit of space to listen, right? I think we're all passionate about these issues, right? We wouldn't be spending all this time in these meetings if we weren't passionate. We all have strongly held views and opinions, and that's not a bad thing, but we all need to try to create a little bit of space, a little bit of room to like hear each other, maybe create a little bit of room to, allow for some of the things that we think we know to maybe be challenged a little bit, right? And that's the only way we're ever going to get, to any kind of consensus on things. You know, I'm not really interested in just spending all this time for having us all sort of, you know, beat each other over the head with our opposing viewpoints. And at the end of the day, not agreeing on anything. I don't think that's a terribly good use of anyone's time. So I just want to kind of encourage and challenge people to, you know, try to make a little space to listen and maybe be willing to let your mind be changed, you know, a little bit on some things that maybe, you know, you know, kind of are holding kind of firmly to at the moment. So with that, let's jump into the proposals. I've had a
Tom?
request. Yeah.
Sorry for interrupting you. It just popped in my head. Maybe if you could explain for those of you that were not present in yesterday's meeting, the selection of topics of the proposals and where we're headed in terms of topics and what we did yesterday and how it's sort of like a continuation from yesterday's topics, just like an overall overview.
Sure. So, well, a couple of the proposals that were considered yesterday were related to funding in particular, right? But then we did get into a proposal that was similar to themes that we're getting into today, which was the last proposal we discussed was related to, you know, kind of comprehensive planning for New Jersey's public forest lands. And it got into some issues also, you know, issues of proforestation versus active management, right? And we know some those are some of the bigger issues and more hotly sort of contested issues. We tabled that proposal. We'll be continuing the discussion, in particular, of proforestation at the climate work group session on August 15th. And maybe at this, we'll have to see. We haven't really discussed what will make sense for this group, whether we need to have both groups tackle proforestation or whether we'll have a different agenda set for the August 16th meeting of this group. But a lot of the proposals that we're bringing forward today in this group are similar in that 3 of the 4 are really about this notion of, you know, planning, science-based planning, public input, kind of at the 10,000 foot level, you know, when we think about our public forest lands, as opposed to, you know, sort of some of the more specific issues. It's really kind of starting at that 10,000 foot level. So, which we thought was sort of a reasonable place to start. So Anjali, I don't know if I did what you were hoping I would do there. Do you anything you want to add or okay?
No, that was perfect. Thank you, Tom.
Okay, good. We did have a request. Is Jacqueline Rhodes on by telephone? Jacqueline, are you there? If Jacqueline is on the phone, I think to unmute herself, what does she have to do? Is it star?
No, it looks like she's on regularly. Yeah.
Can we unmute Jacqueline Rhodes?
Yes, we can. Oops.
Jim Lyons, I know we had you teed up first, but Jacqueline is, I think, in Puerto Rico, maybe.
Oh.
And so she's joining us under difficult circumstances, and she asked if she could go first. I think that's
I'm here, Tom.
Okay, great. So
Okay.
Jim, if it's okay with you, we're going to flip-flop the order. We're going to have Jacqueline, then we'll go to Jim after that. So, so go ahead, Jacqueline. Why don't you take a little bit of time just to describe your proposal to everyone?
Okay, thanks, Tom, and I appreciate the slight modification so I could continue on with my vacation. And thank you to some people that emailed me about my proposal. And I will say that this proposal to develop—
Hey, Jacqueline, I'm sorry to interrupt. And could you introduce, you know, yourself and who you represent? We also want to make sure we kind of realize that in all cases, we weren't having people before they comment. Just tell everyone who you are, because there's a lot of people here and, you know, not everyone knows everyone.
Yep, my apologies. So I'm Jacqueline Rhodes. I'm the Assistant Executive Director at Pinelands Preservation Alliance. And if you're not familiar with the Pinelands PPA, we're a watchdog organization, obviously very strictly focused on the Pinelands National Reserve, although obviously we get involved in a lot of statewide issues supporting our partner organizations, but also because things like this obviously have an impact statewide, but of course down in South Jersey in the Pinelands area. And we've very much obviously are concerned about the state of the Pinelands, its forested areas, have been involved in these type of conversations for a number of years now. I personally have been involved since goodness, at least a decade or more. I've been working with my organization for, it's going on 17 years now. I have a science background, not in forestry or ecology, but just generally in environmental science, and then graduate in environmental policy. So, hopefully with what I'm presenting today as it relates to ecological community plans, looking at the forested area more from a holistic standpoint, definitely welcome feedback from those that are more well-versed in these topics. But just to give a little bit of background, so obviously we're all here because there has been quite a bit of healthy debate among different groups, scientists, about the way to manage our forest areas. And if you all recall, and I'm sure this has come up in previous meetings, that back in the day, Senator Smith had made a proposal for requiring essentially like forest stewardship plans and forest management plans. And definitely there is a need for some stewardship, right? But at that time, there's a lot of debate, which there continues to be, about how to do that. And when you say forests, in my mind, obviously you're just looking at the trees and the collection of trees, even though, as many foresters would say, as well as other individuals that work on forest stewardship plans or forestry, they do have to look at other elements, where wetlands come in, waterways, rare plants and other species as part of that management of those trees. And one thing that a number of organizations, again, we're talking about almost 10 years ago, had looked at or had proposed was developing plans that are looking at ecological communities, which is, what I had shared with everyone. And essentially that means being a little bit more proactive, right? So as it stands now, that, if you have a particular proposal where you want to manage a particular species in a forested area, obviously that's your focus. What are the best characteristics? What are the best practices in place in order to manage for a bird species or for a particular plant or for the stand of trees? And of course that has a benefit, and it is very hard to manage for everything all at the same time, but really having a good, thorough collection of information of all the things that exist in a particular forested area, and again, going by our state forests or potentially even for private land areas, you might look at, okay, what is the collection of things that exist here? And really what's important and what should we be managing for, not just the collection of trees, although the two can go hand in hand. So really the idea there is to, again, be more proactive, go in there, do these plans. And somebody had shared with me, I guess, a natural areas management plan that was done a number of years ago for one of the state forested areas. And it could be something similar to what has been done in the past. But again, the question is, what exists currently now that DEP has that looks at the collection of species and best management practices for various plants, animals, and forested area, and potentially even waterways and wetlands and soils that would then guide the practices. And so when people come in with plans to do some kind of management, you have your menu and all your information there. Now, a lot of these pieces of information exist separately. You have the heritage program. Great, botanists and people that have been working in this program for years that know where the species exists, right? They know some of the best practices. They know as well, whether the species is declining, it's increasing. And of course, they even manage at a more micro level as well, because sometimes, of course, those plants don't really need a whole lot of wide scale management, but it may require clearing some trees. The same goes for a number of different species and items that exist within our forested area. So in no way, as part of the proposal, am I trying to say that this is a lot of new groundwork where you'd have to go out and do tons of surveys. A lot of this information already exists. And, in talking to different representatives of DEP, they say, they do try and want to put all these pieces together, but obviously you need direction, you need a requirement to do this, to make it a high priority. In addition, using a term that best encompasses the entirety of the forested area, not just the trees, or not just saying, again, at the forest level, also, in my mind, is a very good public outreach tool. It lets the public know, we're focused on the ecological health of this forested area, that we're managing for multiple things, that we've taken this into consideration and trying to pull in the partners similar to what we're doing now with this, this work group. And so I know that was one concern that somebody had asked about was, again, where do you get the resources from? Well, I think a lot of the pieces are already there to pull together to develop these ecological plans. And again, changing the name of what we're calling a plan to help manage these state forested areas, again, I think would also help show that the mindset is there to make this a priority ecologically as opposed to just piecemeal. So I had included an example. There's not many places that do this that I've been able to find, but it looks like there's an initiative at West California to be able to do this similar process, and they've actually already started to do it. Would love to. I haven't had a chance to talk to them further of how well it's working, and learn more about the process as it unfolds. But it is something that I think, again, based upon our unique species that we have here, the difference between the pinelands and the highlands, that there needs to be an effort that, again, collectively pulls all those pieces together. And in terms of how do you fund it, well, I did not participate in the meeting yesterday, but I heard there are a lot of funding proposals to look at management. And I think maybe tying those pieces together. So obviously I did not include that or try to, create my own proposal, because I think a lot of people have some good ideas where we can obviously, based upon what we decide collectively works well in terms of funding for how we manage our forests, can then feed into whatever we collectively decide is the best way to do that stewardship and management. So hopefully that was a good enough overview to leave enough time for questions and thoughts.
Yeah, that's great, Jacqueline. So let's go right to clarifying questions. Again, we don't want commentary. We're going to get to a point where we ask if there are people that have objections to this, but for now, we want clarifying questions only. So can we unmute Ken?
Great, so thanks. There's a lot to like about this, but my major question is, how is this going to fix the problem we have today with DEP? There's no real controls. They're not regulated. They're not following by a lot of our position, our thinking, best science. They're making their own policies based on things like industry canards, like cutting local forests to avoid importing wood. I see nothing here that is going to fix the major problem that basically brought us all together. I have some suggestions, but that's my question.
Jacqueline, do you want to respond to that? Do we need to unmute Jacqueline again? Can she?
Yeah, sorry about that. I didn't know I would be muted when I hit the button. I mean, it's a good point. It reminds me of any other regulation out there where you're trying to correct the problem in the future as opposed to dealing with the issues in the past, right? So sometimes those two things have to be separate. I think, in my opinion now, this would help guide the future. Obviously, there's a number of mechanisms or language you could build into this if it were to become a bill where, again, it all depends on what the political officials agree to and regulatory officials agree to. But you can say, obviously that guides practices in the future. You have to have the experts look at, okay, what pieces of information do we have already? These are the plans that we already have in place. Maybe that piece of information guides any new permits or any new plans for very particular management of individual species. So yes, there are a couple options. Now, in terms of things that are happening now, in my opinion, I think it really comes down to that subcommittee that's looking at regulations. They need to look at, okay, what regulations currently exist that allow that, even with legislation that says, okay, you need to develop these community-wide conservation plans, you will still need the rules in place that say specifically what is going to be approved to be done and not. Right. So I think it's a two-piece, two-prong effort there where the two have to go hand in hand. Looking at what currently exists, what they're allowed to do, how can that be tweaked or fixed, and then look at, okay, now from a holistic standpoint, these are things that we have. This is how we want to manage. We need to be looking at the lens of climate change, ecological health. What are the impacts or the stressors on the system? It really is going to be a much more holistic, proactive approach. And that can be hard, definitely can. And does that mean new projects stop? Not sure. I'm sure some people would propose that, but I think it's going to have to be a combination of those two efforts together. So I'm really looking forward to see what summary and information comes out of the regulatory discussion that can match up nicely with any new legislation.
All right, thanks.
Great.
So yeah, I agree. We need, top-down direction maybe from the legislature on what's permitted, what's not, and then work within that framework.
Right.
Okay, great. So let's go to Don with the next clarifying question. Can we unmute Don? Thank you.
Jacqueline, to my knowledge, I think the last few plans over the past decade or probably not beyond that the State Forest Service has tried to develop. Some of them they're not finished with, but I'll use like Double Trouble or the Whiting Plan as an example. Maybe I'm pretty confident that they don't use the term Forest Stewardship Plan. I think they use a term called a Natural Resource Management Plan and the underlying premise that I was told was that for the very reasons that you're talking about, they wanted it to be more in capturing, every kind of resource and not just forest stewardship. This discussion that you referenced earlier from the legislation that we tried to collectively work on maybe a decade ago, where as an outside group of the DEP, we were pushing for some kind of, planning or agreement on planning. And we were tossing around the word forest stewardship plan. But as far as I know, to get to my point, the DEP currently in the plans that they're working on, they call them natural resource management plans. So I'm wondering, fundamentally, your proposal, how would that be different from what they're currently doing now at the Forest Service?
Yeah, that's a good point, Don. I agree. I knew they were working on that. It was a little bit of a slow process, though, because it's been a number of years now. I think that the clarification needs to be, one, what are the pieces that go into those natural resources management plans, how they match up with what we think should be in there, which might be all the same. But then also, how is that being used as a tool to guide future stuff? So that's where the legislation would come in to say, okay, you need to use these things, which you may already have. Make sure they have these pieces together, but use that as the guidance for, and make sure that is codified. That, okay, you have to match up to our natural resources management plan, make sure you're meeting X, Y, and Z, and just kind of connecting those pieces together. So
Okay.
I agree with you that they had already started doing that. I know that it's taking a good bit of time, and maybe that's where connecting in the funding to help make those plans happen a bit quicker and make sure everything's matching up and that people are aware of all the pieces that go into it and how it's being used to match up with proposals for managing individual species within those plans.
Okay, so just so that I'm clear, and I think I am, you're saying that the legislation would actually call out all those different resources that have to be addressed within this, instead of just kind of letting the state do what they're doing now and kind of triaging and dealing with the resources that are present on each property, right?
Yep.
Yep, okay. Thank you.
Okay. Do we have other clarifying questions? I see, is it Larry Baum? Go ahead, Larry.
Oh, yeah, we were going to ask people to identify themselves if they have questions.
Yes,
and
please
if-
do
if-
identify yourself before you ask a question.
And if they're associated with an organization.
Larry, you should be able to go. Is it Larry or is it Ilse? Now you're unmuted. Go ahead. We're not hearing you, so you may be having difficulty with your audio. Okay. While Larry's sorting that out, I just want to make sure, I guess I'm going to ask my own clarifying question. Just the exchange between Jacqueline and Don. So that if I understand correctly, there are natural resource management plans in development for all the state forest lands. And so, but Jacqueline's point was that they're not happening quickly enough and we need more legislative direction to define what should constitute those plans so that they truly are those kind of ecosystem-based holistic type plans that Jacqueline is describing in her proposal, and that they then become the basis for any kind of future management activities. Did I get that right? I just want to make sure I'm hearing.
That's correct, Tom. So like, for instance, the Pinelands Commission did approve one for Double Trouble State Park a number of years ago. I remember some of, the scientists that we had on staff and on the board have reviewed it to look at, the elements of it. And there were definitely very good pieces put together as part of that plan. But again, is that truly collective of all the things that we want to have in it? We haven't evaluated from that standpoint. And what do collectively we all agree should be included in those plans in terms of addressing those natural resources and how to manage them? So it's almost like, in my mind, like you can't necessarily call out everything, but almost like a menu of things that you think collectively will help manage multiple species at various different times. But you're right that we don't have any kind of law now or regulations that point to that plan as being used as guidance for any projects that come forward. Now, maybe the department says, well, we do this, but where is that written, or where's their guidance or regulations that dictate that? Because again, I'm not aware of that at all. So yes, essentially what you said.
Okay, and is that happening for every public forest land? And what about, will this also apply to just fish and wildlife lands as well? Was that part of your?
That's a good question. When we PPA met with staff that were developing early on the natural resources plan, they said that was their goal, was to develop one for all their state parks and forests. Now, whether or not they're doing that for fish and wildlife, I'm not sure. But again, it's been a very slow process considering that one was 2015. And understandably,
but your proposal is just for public forest land, not all forested state lands.
It could be.
That's your proposal. I'd say you decide. What's your?
No. But what did you say? Sorry. So I had said state parks and forests, or actually state-owned lands, not just state parks and forests, but not
all
private.
state-owned lands.
Yeah.
Okay, so I just want people to be clear on what the proposal is. So this would be a requirement for all state lands, right? And then the other piece is that it would then also, there would be some statutory requirement that those plans be the basis for, right? Be a basis upon which any sort of specific management plans or activities would be based.
Correct.
Okay. All right. So Larry, are you able to speak now? I saw Larry put something in the chat. If not, we can read off the question. Mic is not working. Was going to ask if the plan would include safeguards against management being a cover for logging. almost always once active management is allowed, it ends up getting exploited either quickly or the long term. Already we see DEP knowing vernal pools were in clear-cut areas in Sparta and doing it anyway. Everyone can read. No, I guess everyone can't read this, can you? All right, I'll just read it all then. Knowing state endangered raptors were in cut zones and still went ahead and cut. We were told amphibians had laid eggs in pools and refused to stop logging trucks going in anyway. And if we simply keep the land as is, as we mostly have for the last number of decades, is the huge risk from this worth the occasional possible small benefit? So I guess there's a question in there, Jacqueline.
Well, in regards to the safeguards, essentially was the question, right? And I think that's why having a natural resource plan, or whatever we call it, I mean, obviously the state has already started to develop some, could be used as the baseline. So, right, you're coming at this because you recognize all these different species as well as resources that you should be protecting and managing in a certain way, making sure that if there's going to be a negative impact on one, it is worthwhile. But the collective goal is to, again, manage the community, not necessarily just looking at it from one standpoint. So the safeguards have to be, one, what do we identify as our criteria list? Two, making sure there is a plan in place that already collectively looks at the community as a whole. And three, then those regulations come in where, you have to decide upon when somebody comes in with an application or a permit or a forest stewardship plan or whatever the case is afterwards, that it's meeting the goals for that area. So that, in my mind, would be the safeguard. And then, obviously we have this separate group that's looking at the regulations.
Okay. Okay, so as far as clarifying questions, I'd like to first go to people who haven't asked a clarifying question already. So I think next on the list there would be Jeffrey. Can we unmute Jeffrey?
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
So my question is just, you said this is going to be the
Can you
basis.
introduce yourself first, Jeffrey?
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, thank
Jeffrey
you.
Lomar. I work with Ocean County Parks. I oversee the natural lands program and our properties. My question is, you want this to be the basis for how things are managed in the future. And I guess at what point do you come over and reevaluate? Is it a 10-year thing? Is it a 5-year thing? Because once you become an actionable plan based on these guidelines, the environment's changing. Things can happen from year to year. Political parties could change, and bosses could change. There's a number of things that can happen. So, are you proposing that there's a reevaluation period after a certain number of years?
Yeah, that's a good point. As it relates to, population of certain species can change. You might find out that, what was once there has disappeared. And obviously then, you would have to update that. The Pinelands Commission had a process where they went through and did a watershed, an evaluation of each of the watersheds in the Pinelands area. And they had said that, they'd go back through and update those plans periodically after several years, because obviously conditions change. I think that would definitely have to be part of the process. What is the magic number? That's a good question. Obviously, it depends upon what resources are available. Obviously, it's something that can be built into the legislation to state, every so many years, these plans will be updated. So I agree with you. There has to be an element of that. But again, I think it depends upon the scientific community stating, okay, what seems to be a good number of years. And we can look at the model that's used by the Pinelands Commission. And then also, is there going to be some kind of dedicated resource funding, that's can be used?
That was going to be my
updating.
follow-up, is how many resources, both monetarily and physically, do you foresee needing to be dedicated to this?
Right.
Because it's a big ask on the state for all of the properties they have statewide.
Right. And again, they obviously did one, which we have to evaluate, find out from them. But if they had, I think, like almost everything we're asking for, if they had more staff, that could be dedicated to that. But I think in my mind, just based upon previous experience, there's a lot of information that's already out there, and it's putting it together all in one document. So you have this holistic picture of, those particular areas, as opposed to having it in separate departments and in separate areas. So some things are already being surveyed, like plant species. They have part-time people going out and surveying different species almost every year, every other year. Obviously that would get updated, so you'd have that. Maybe the same for on the wildlife side of things. So again, I think some of those numbers have to be evaluated, and of course it's a combination of resources as well as the science.
Okay, great. So let's go to John Thonay with a question. Can we unmute John Thonay?
Yes, Jack. A quick question. I know that what you're proposing probably sounds like awfully big for an entire state, but I am a little more familiar with the New Jersey Highlands, and I'm thinking maybe that's pretty comparable of an area where this could be done, where something similar to what is being done in the Pinelands might be applicable to that very large region. Are you anticipating doing this for every single piece of, publicly owned land in the state, or just for certain areas?
Well, I think the goal should be obviously state-owned forested areas and wildlife management areas. Obviously, certain parks, obviously that would not be necessary depending upon, what the place is. So obviously developing a list of, what areas would be included. Here's your list of places that you have to do this for DEP.
Now,
Which-
I would also note that we have publicly owned lands that aren't necessarily state-owned, but they come under the jurisdiction of the Green Acres programs because public money was used to purchase those lands.
Mhm.
And they're owned by counties, and they're owned by some by nonprofits, some by municipalities. Would we be looking to somehow incorporate what the goals and objectives of the Green Acres program is into preparing plans for those properties?
It's a good question. I think the state should always be the model that we use first, and then see if you go to the other lands, other publicly managed, or like you said, used Green Acres fundings for county level or municipal level.
Well, these are actually Green Acres rules on properties that have already been purchased using Green Acres money. Some of them are state-owned, but many of them are owned by counties and municipalities, but they're purchased with public money. And they're public forests.
Right. Yeah, no, it's a good point. My point being that if you have a new law that says you have to develop these, are you actually going to require this in this new bill for anything that has used like public funding to match those Green Acres rules? Or do we not include that now to do this model first and then evaluate that later?
Okay, I'm just throwing out the question.
Yeah.
Thank you.
No.
I like your proposal.
Good point.
Okay. So we're about now 30 minutes on this proposal. I'm just flagging, being a timekeeper. So I do want to try to move us along here. We got a few more questions. Looks like Douglas Meckel would be next.
Hi, quick clarifying question, because I've heard this evolve a little bit. And they said, at one point you said all state lands, and I'm just private citizen. I have a forest stewardship plan, but I'm a retired court official, so I'm familiar with laws and legislation.
Mhm.
And when you say all state land, the state owns a hell of a lot of land. They own DOT lands, they own lands on psychiatric facilities, prisons, that sort of thing. So I'm just suggesting that you carefully define the scope of which lands you would like to regulate. And just
Okay.
name, is it wildlife management, parks, forests? Because at one point they said all state lands. And if you say all state lands, you just, at some point, you're gonna cause unneeded drama. That's all I'm saying, so.
Agree. Yes, that just to clarify, I was just trying to refer to state versus county, municipal. But yes, agree.
Yeah. Good clarification. Thank you. Joe Bosralian?
Hey, Jacqueline, Joe Bezralian, Chatham Township Open Space Committee. Could you clarify, does your plan, does your proposal presuppose that the DEP won't just do performative analysis to achieve a certain predetermined outcome? Does it presuppose that there will be reporting and accountability to the certain members of the public, either through public disclosure or through a public comment period? Does it presuppose a follow-up inspection by state officials? And does it presuppose that there's resources for enforcement of violations of the plan? Is that all built into your thinking, or do you think that would be separate proposals?
Yeah, good point, Joe. I think that came up before about the safeguard. So we have to set the bar. And so this proposal is really about looking at it from an ecological whole. Then you have to have the regulations in. So when people come in to want to achieve a certain management practice, that you would have those pieces built in. So that's where I was saying, I think going back to having that regulatory subgroup that's looking at what safeguards and what is allowed and the monitoring and all that would be completely separate from this proposal. This is purely saying, almost like we're capturing what we have here. This is our ecological, goals for this area. This is what we know we need to manage for and protect or enhance. And when you come in, because you're like, we want to help with certain things, we want to make sure the DP is matching up to their proactive plan, that it's coming about not because somebody has recommended a certain management practice and now they have to pull the pieces together of looking at, well, what wetlands do we have there, what water resources, what plants, et cetera, how about climate change? But rather doing this proactively in a more holistic way, so you have something to compare to and you have all the pieces together, again, knowing you have to update it periodically. So that's what this proposal is trying to achieve. What do you have to use as your menu, as your baseline for managing your, let's say it's Wharton State Forest, that you can turn to? And then based upon an individual's proposal for doing, protection of, pine barren extension, for instance, how does that compare to what we evaluated? And then, okay, now they have to go through the process of pulling certain permits and what are their safeguards? How are they monitoring those activities that are happening? So that would be separate.
Okay. Yeah, and other proposals may, round this out, right, and fill in some of those complementary pieces. Let's go to Bronwyn next.
Hey, Jacqueline, this is Bronwyn Ellis over at the Pinelands Commission. I'm just a little confused because it's not clear to me how this is different, at least in the Pinelands area, from an approved forestry plan that addresses teeny plant and animal species and their protection or their management. Can you clarify how this is different? I'm still not clear on it.
Jacqueline, you're muted.
I am?
Oh, you show as being muted, but I can hear you. Go ahead, say something.
Oh, okay.
No,
Can you
you're
hear
okay.
me?
I don't know why you're shown is muted, but we can hear.
So those regulatory pieces obviously will always be there because you have to make sure that the practices that someone's recommending are going to protect those species. But from a higher level viewpoint, what do we want to achieve in a particular forested area? You know, where is that written down? Where is that stated that, you know, okay, we know in Warren State Forest, obviously we know so many of these different species exist. We want a comprehensive plan that pulls all those pieces together that says, okay, we know the X, Y, and Z exists here. We know this is their levels. We know that these species work together jointly. We need them both to exist. We know that there are certain wetland areas here. So obviously they would still have to go through and make sure, okay, we're checking off that we're protecting, and the Pinelands Commission has to review it to make sure that whatever forestry activity is taking place and meet those requirements. But now there would be this comprehensive plan that the public can see, review, they know exists there, and matches up and shares all the community characteristics. And there are certain goals that are planned out ahead of time for that particular area. So it doesn't change that process. It doesn't change the commission process. It's more, again, from, like I was using the Pinelands Commission example where they did a watershed analysis, right? You have that, which can be a very good tool to use to look at management later on, even when proposals come in to do it. Does that make sense?
Okay, great. Thanks, Jacqueline. It looks like Bronwyn is muted again. So I'm going to go to Elliot, and hopefully then I'll go back to Don if he still has a second question. Then we're gonna try to call the question here. Elliot?
Thanks. Hey, Jacqueline. I think this is the gold standards inventory that eventually we'll need to make if we want to get where we need to go. But I mean, for someone who is really leading the campaign of Fix Our Parks, you know how tough budgets are at state parks and other parks. And if the this inventory isn't done as comprehensively as it should be, it loses its value greatly, may even be corrupted, and something we wouldn't want. How do you prevent that? How do you make sure it remains comprehensive and looks at all ecological values, if there isn't enough money to afford it?
Right. Well, first we have to come up with what the, you know, in the proposal list out the criteria and things that you look at. But I think obviously, you know, if it moves forward, having further discussion on those elements. Right now, like Don had stated, you know, the state is working on some of these things, but it's been, you know, an in-house process. You know, what does the public know about what gets included in a natural resource plan where they feel comfortable that it is holistic enough, right? So that's why we need to have the discussion and why we need to have a piece of legislation that outlines that very specifically so people are aware of what that includes, right? In addition, I think that in terms of the funding, that is something we definitely need to talk about, because if you don't have holistic plans, and not that I'm a planner by any means, but I do see the benefit of having plans to really set the future for what we need to achieve, as opposed to having piecemeal efforts. So we, the public, can use those plans to hold up to say, look, this is what's in there. Obviously is one way to help safeguard so when proposals come in, or, you know, why wasn't this included in this plan? We know X, Y, and Z exist, or this resource needs to be protected, and so on, to bring that scientific support, you know, to that. And then obviously using it as a baseline can help inform the decisions moving forward. So, I mean, as you and I both know, Elliot, there's, I guess, no absolute way to safeguard against everything, but I think starting out on this process, we can try to have that gold standard moving forward, and then also try to get the resources that we need, not only for this, but multiple things that we need the state to do to protect our parks and forests.
Okay, great. So let's go, hopefully last to Don. Joe, is that a legacy hand or leftover hand or whatever we want to call it there? Or did you have another one too? If it's a leftover.
Sorry, sorry about that.
No problem. Go ahead, Don.
Okay, Jacqueline's Don with Audubon again. Something that came up in the earlier rules proposal, which is probably relevant to this, is that and going back to the double trouble plan that we both mentioned, that was developed with some collaboration from stakeholders, but it was done before this 14-step process that the state is using as a policy was put into effect. I'm wondering if you would consider, and I see their need to have public input in this, and maybe that resolves some of the questions that are surrounding, like, what is the content? If the proposal included a mechanism to have some kind of stakeholder process before and during the plan development process, maybe that's a way to keep this from becoming excessively expensive by having to capture a bunch of information on every single property that may not be relevant, but also providing a mechanism so that the state would have some input on what resources are important on certain properties and could devote more energy towards exploring those rather than just kind of getting some information about everything. And I think that would dovetail with a lot of the other issues of concern that we're coming up with, regulations. So getting some kind of memorialization of, whatever that public stakeholder process is probably important. I'm wondering if you would consider that as part of the proposal.
And just if I could just interject there for a second, Jacqueline, the next proposal we have teed up is almost exactly that from Jim Lyons. So, I mean, maybe the thing to do is to deal with Jacqueline's proposal as is, tee up Jim's proposal, which is very much about public input, public process, advisory committee. I think these two could nest very well together, but I don't know that Jacqueline needs to amend hers because we have pretty much, the other one on the table next.
Good enough.
But Jacqueline, do you see that differently?
Yep. Don, thank you for reminding me about that 14-point process or steps that they take, because I remember getting that review a number of years ago now. But yeah, Tom, I agree. I think that not only the one next, but even others that I think I've seen before or will be coming up, I think there's an opportunity for, a lot of these things to mesh together. Absolutely. So it'll be exciting.
These proposals are going to build upon each other, right? So each proposal doesn't have to be comprehensive. I think we want to get to something comprehensive in the end, but I think that's going to sort of come together as different proposals are considered and melded.
Absolutely. Sounds good to me.
Okay, hopefully last is Jean Montgomery. Unmute Jean.
Hi. So about the public input process, did a couple of speakers ago, could someone please clarify what the 14-point process was compared to, for example, the Double Trouble State Park plan, where the plan was available for public comment period of 18 days, and all the public written comments and speakers were recorded, and then it was reviewed, and they were sorted and deliberated. How's that different than the Pinelands process, which that plan was part of?
Jacqueline, you could answer that, but again, I don't think your proposal speaks to public input. So I would rather cut off the conversation about public input, pick that up as part of the next proposal. And rather than, we're getting into some issues now that I don't think are part of your proposal. So can we table the public input conversation? It's coming up in the next proposal.
I'm fine with that.
So I would really like to call the question. We've been 45 minutes on this one. We got two more proposals to get to. And I guess I would like to know if anyone objects to Jacqueline's proposal as, somewhat clarified in these conversations, which to me, the clarifications would be, the first piece of this is that there's a comprehensive assessment required for our public lands, specifically our forest, parks, and wildlife management areas, that is ecologically based, right? Holistic in terms of looking at all of the ecological aspects of the forest to establish that baseline information, and to have that information then be the baseline for any management plans or management actions that would then occur on those public lands to have that sort of ecological scientific assessment and baseline done, and to be required to be, considered and a basis for management plans and management activities. Is that a fair characterization of your proposal, Jacqueline, as sort of we kind of clarified it a bit in the conversation? Yes. So, so if the hands are up right now, I'm assuming those are people that are objecting, have issues with that proposal as it was just described. Okay, so Jean, go ahead.
I was involved in an Atlantic white cedar restoration, which, as you may or may not know, the state was involved with and trying to establish in Wharton. And the staff power and expertise needed to do what you're talking about, which I love the idea and the concept, is well beyond the scope of anything that would be possible to do for even one park, let alone all the parks in the state. Maybe for specific areas, once there is a plan in place.
Jean, you cut out, but I'm hearing your concern is the feasibility of doing this and the funding and the resources to do this. So
yes, that's it in a nutshell. It's just wildly unfeasible to even say, go into your backyard and have people go, is this Nice Kearns beak rush, or is it one of the other like 50 beak rushes that aren't endangered? Or was that bird a Blackburnian warbler, or was it a pine warbler? For like species and biotic communities.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Can we unmute Larry Harity? And Larry, please introduce yourself.
Larry Harity, representing NJOA, but I used to work for the Division of Fish and Wildlife. I don't have an objection to this plan, but the first, other than the Rutgers proposal today, there's very similarities between them, these proposals. And I would suggest that you form a subgroup to try to meld all these together, and also look at the plans and the processes like the 14-step plan that forestry uses and Division of Wildlife Management uses as part of this process.
Okay. All right, thank you, Larry. Ken?
So quickly, I am going to oppose this because of the fact that it doesn't have anywhere near sufficient controls over it, although I understand it's only a part of a bigger picture. And frankly, while I probably understand less about some of these things than most people here, this is what I thought the DEP has been telling us it's been doing all along, and the results are very unsatisfactory. So far, this approach has not worked as far as I'm concerned. So I'm going to vote no.
Okay, thanks, Ken. Jeffrey?
I have the same concerns as Jean. I don't think it's feasible. And looking at it from a standpoint of Ocean County, we already have to go through the process of getting a pinelands permit for a majority of our or any work that we want to do. So adding this extra layer and requiring, let's say, a second permit or a second approval just seems counterproductive. Like Brandon said, I struggle to see the difference between this and a pinelands permit.
Jeffrey, just for clarification, I don't think the proposal would relate to other than state lands. It would not relate to county lands. Is that correct, Jacqueline? We're supposed to be talking about state lands, not county lands. So I don't know if that helps, Jeffrey. Can we unmute Jeffrey again?
I understand that we're speaking towards state properties, but inevitably things always trickle down from the state to the county to municipal. And I just don't think we would get behind something that is eventually or has a potential to trickle down to us.
Well, I mean, the proposal is specifically about state lands. It's not county municipal. So that's
Well, we were also then spoke about all state properties, and state properties, the county government is an entity of the state.
Okay. Bronwyn?
I don't know if I could just clarify, and also this specific proposal does not ask for a permit.
Right. Okay. Bronwyn?
Oh, can you hear me? Okay. So same issue as before. To me, it still seems like it's a forestry plan as we would require in the Pinelands, and the same concerns that Jean Montgomery raised regarding the feasibility of the project. And I do recall, to Jeffrey's point, you mentioning permits in your discussion. So you may not have put that in the proposal, but you definitely did indicate, or at least that's what I heard in your discussion, that additional permits may be required for this. So
no, I said that you should use this as a baseline for approving existing permits, not that there would be new permits.
Okay, I misheard you then.
Okay. Larry? Larry, if your audio doesn't work, put it in the chat. Same concern you noted previously. It presupposes the need for management plans all over. Without extreme safeguards, I have never seen not get exploited and do more damage in the long run. Okay. So this is one where, you know, I would look to my fellow co-chairs and sort of call the question about how do we define consensus. We've got 72 participants on the line here. We have 5 people primarily individual citizens raising concerns, mostly about viability and safeguards.
Yep.
You know, those concerns can be noted, and we can consider other proposals to address those concerns. You know, we're already actively talking about funding. We recognize that there are things we're going to recommend here that are going to need funding. I also personally would not, I think we should call for what's needed, knowing that sometimes what's needed doesn't seem viable and may be difficult to achieve, but I would hate for us not to call for what is needed to predetermine for ourselves what can or can't be accomplished. So I personally would be comfortable calling this a consensus item with some concerns that are noted that would be clearly documented. But, you know, I turn to my co-chairs for their views on that.
I agree, Tom, absolutely. I think these are valid concerns that have been raised. And I think that in the narrative of the report, when this idea is discussed, we can include those caveats easily. So I would agree that there's somewhat of consensus here with those caveats. And if someone felt very strongly as a detractor, as with any idea, they would have an opportunity to provide separate narrative. But overall, what I'm hearing is that people like the idea. It seems like it's too much. It would cost too much. And I agree with you, Tom. Let's not use that as our reason to cast an idea away. Let's think of ways to fund things that don't currently have funding. So I don't know if Andy has an opinion.
Andy stepped away, and I think Anjali had to.
Yeah, she had to go.
Okay. So we'll hear from Andy when he comes back, and we'll verify that Anjali is on the same page. I think another indicator of consensus is we've got four co-chairs who are coming at this from different organizations and different perspectives. And if we think we heard consensus, if any one of us disagrees, that would be another indicator of a lack of consensus. So I think we're going to tentatively call this a consensus item. We're going to document the concerns about viability. We're going to have conversations about funding. And we're going to have conversations about safeguards, Ken. I think, you know, yeah, there's going to be other proposals that are designed to deal with safeguards that Ken and Larry are concerned about. So with that, I want to turn it over to Jim Lyons. the proposal is very similar along the lines of, planning, and it gets into some of the public input issues. So I think it's a really good proposal to consider, back to back with this one. So Jim, thanks for being patient, and you're there. Please unmute Jim, and let's let
Yep.
Jim describe.
Can
his
you hear me
proposal.
now, Tom?
Yes.
Okay, very good. Well, no, thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to participate. Very interesting conversation. I have to say it's one I've heard many times before at the federal level. So by way of background, for those who don't know me, I'm from New Jersey, grew up in North Jersey, spent most of my childhood in the Highlands, which is where I fell in love with nature and decided to get into natural resources. I have an undergraduate degree from Rutgers in natural resource management. I'm old, 1977, then went to Yale and got a master's degree. That led to opportunities to work really at the national level. I started my career working with the Fish and Wildlife Service in Washington, D.C., working on policy issues. I eventually ended up working in Congress for the House Agriculture Committee and was involved in a whole host of natural resource issues, helped put together the 1990 Farm Bill, which created some conservation programs that all of you are benefiting from and utilizing. I ended up in the Clinton administration. I was Undersecretary for Natural Resources and Environment in the Clinton administration for 8 years. And there I put together the Northwest Forest Plan with a team of scientists that I brought in to work on. Jack Ward Thomas, Jerry Franklin, Norm Johnson, names you probably have heard. After that, I taught at Yale for 3 years, taught natural resource policy, and then returned back to government later in life to work for President Obama at the Interior Department as a Deputy Assistant Secretary focusing on lands. In terms of planning experience, as I've already alluded to, is very much involved in developing the Northwest Forest Plan. And if you have any interest in that, and since the controversy that comes with planning, there's a great, what is it called? Yeah, it's a great podcast called Timber Wars. And if you listen to that, I think you'll get a good sense of what real controversy is about, and the battle to put in place the strategy that we did to protect old growth forests. Was involved in production of the roadless rule. And as I said, tail end of my career working for President Obama, was the lead in putting together the Greater Sage-Grouse Conservation Plan across the Western states. I don't want to get into the details of planning process. I just simply say that I think what's essential is that, first of all, we recognize that forests are obviously far more than trees. I think what's important is that we recognize the values of forests as ecosystems, and particularly given the threats of climate change, to work to ensure greater resilience, to protect biodiversity, certainly watershed health, since the watersheds, particularly in North Jersey, are critical, and in South Jersey, to the welfare of people in New Jersey and elsewhere. An important issue I've worked on for years is equitable access, and one that's emerging. The state is soon to create an outdoor recreation commission. There's tremendous opportunities there to expose more New Jerseyans, more people to the value of nature and the outdoors, and those are things I've really been supportive of. I think I would emphasize from my experience in working on forest planning, and I was heavily involved in putting together the Forest Services planning process, working on that over many years, that really what's critical is that people be involved in the process. I would make this point at the outset. I think it matters less what you call the planning process than that it be built with full public participation, be based on sound science, and that the agencies be accountable for implementing the plans that they develop in partnership with the public, and that there's a means to monitor performance and to ensure when performance is not consistent with those plans, that either the plans be modified again through a public process, or the agencies be held accountable for actually complying with what the plans call for. Planning is always a controversial process. Plans themselves don't resolve controversy, but I do think that legislating a forest planning process or natural resource management, natural resource planning process is critical. that creates kind of the legislative framework and hopefully the authority to move forward with planning. But again, what's critical is the partnership that comes between the people involved in developing the plans, the people that are involved in commenting on the plans, and ultimately the people who are going to benefit from or be concerned about the outcomes of the plans. And that partnership with state officials is critical. So I just frame very briefly, since you've talked a lot about planning processes, the elements that I think are essential to a planning process. I think first and foremost, the agencies need to recognize, as well as the public, that we're managing public lands. And so it's critically important that the forests and for that matter, state parks, or at least the forest elements we're talking about in state parks, be managed to achieve conditions that reflect the values, views, and desired outcomes of the public based on sound science and best available information. I mean, that's a compact that has to be agreed to if any of this is to be successful. It's important that the process ensure opportunities for public input and oversight, and for the public's participation in the management of the public forests, consistent with the legal framework that's in place, and again, based on sound science and the management objectives that everybody agrees to. I would advocate for the creation of a science advisory committee to oversee this entire process, people with diverse backgrounds, but strong understanding of natural resource management, of land stewardship, with different views and values, whether they're for pro-forestation or they're more focused on, some would argue, silviculture or timber management. It's essential that those views be reflected in the kind of input and oversight and guidance that is provided both the planning process and the plans as they evolve. I would suggest that plans be developed first for the forests, but that plans also be developed for state parks, particularly for the heavily forested elements of those parks, to ensure their long-term stewardship subject to their legal mandates and also the management goals and objectives of the public. I think it's also important to have periodic inventory and analysis of the condition of the forest. Right now, the state relies heavily on the Forest Service's inventory and analysis program, and I think that's a good foundation. But I think there's other information that could be developed by the state to meet the specific needs of those states for managing for the issues affecting the states, whether it's a disease issue or it's outdoor recreation needs or it's watershed health. It's important that that information is available. I think a way to start this would be to convene a series of meetings across the state to help the interested publics understand their forests, learn about the forests and what they can be managed for, and to have a broader dialogue about what it is we seek to achieve across state lands. But that the outcome of these processes should be individual forest plans that identify management objectives, that also talk about the actions to be taken, how we're involved in monitoring the performance of the agencies achieving those outcomes. Seems to me that those are critical. And we've done both for the national forests and for public for the national parks. Oh, I'm sorry, a call came in and I couldn't get rid of it. That's spam for you. But what I said was, I think it's also important that the state consider working to create local advisory groups or friends groups for each of the state forests. And the same would be true, I think, for the parks, as a mechanism to ensure that there is constant feedback and opportunities for the public to comment and, if you will, critique the management success or problems associated with the management of each of these landscapes, so that there's this constant feedback. I would personally advocate for, based on my experience, developing a process that is authorized by the state legislature, but not one that requires the state legislature to be involved in every planning decision or in every dispute. That's the kind of process that should be developed between the public, particularly the publics involved in developing these plans, public advisory groups or friends groups, and the forest managers and public employees who are responsible for implementing those plans. Developing those relationships and developing that partnership is the best way to achieve the outcomes we all seek to achieve. And I add a final note is, outcomes have changed over time during my career. When I started with interior, timber harvest was a big issue. And I was involved in the transformation from a timber-based management strategy to one focused in particular on conserving old growth forests. It was controversial. It was challenging. But in the end, the science and public opinion ruled the day, and we eventually got to a point where now many of those landscapes are managed for conservation, for wildlife protection, watershed health, and it's actually had a tremendous positive effect in the Northwest, in this case, on the economy and the growth of that region. And I think the same can be true for the stewardship of our public lands here in the state, not only to protect our natural resources, but to grow natural resource-based economy in areas like the Pinelands and areas like the Highlands, so that local economies can see the benefits of good land stewardship and be supportive of efforts to try to conserve these lands for future generations. And I'll leave it at that.
Great, thank you, Jim. There's a lot there, and it's terrific to have the benefit of your your long experience and expertise in dealing with these issues around the country. So thank you for your sharing your time and for your proposal. So let's go first to clarifying questions. Anyone have clarifying questions for Jim? Must be questions out there. I will be shocked. Jim, while people are thinking about that, I have a question for you. Do you view your proposal as largely consistent with, but kind of building upon the proposal that was just discussed? I mean, what are your thoughts on the interrelation between your proposal and the previous proposal?
No, I see a great deal of complementary points and processes. I credit Jacqueline for that.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are some pieces of your proposal that we discussed previously, for example, that were not a big focus in Jacqueline's. Like, to me, the sort of very comprehensive public input process that you lay out, including the opportunity for the public to appeal a plan, draft plans before they're finalized. So that whole kind of very robust public input process, which could nest into the proposal that we had previously from Jacqueline, the establishment of a scientific advisory council that could guide both the way these ecological assessments are conducted, right? That's sort of a new idea there that, again, could nest with the previous proposal. You mentioned inventory analysis, which is, again, I think a big part that's necessary for any kind of ecological assessment that Jacqueline's proposal envisions, right, is going to require inventory analysis.
Because one other point I make, Tom, and I think this is consistent with what Jacqueline proposed, but if we can put together, I would suggest legislation in the state legislature to authorize this process, so that individual legislators don't have to be involved in overseeing and guiding implementation of the process, but sign off on a process to achieve this. Then it falls to the agencies and the public to make sure that the process is implemented consistent with what the law requires. I think holding people accountable, whether they're state officials or they're the public that's interested in and engaged in the process, holding them accountable for working together to try to find solutions to problems and agree on a common set of values they want to achieve with their plan, is the road to success. If there's not a mechanism to do that, you have nothing but controversy and conflict, and people don't learn how to work together to protect our natural resources, which in the end is ultimately what's going to take if we're going to be successful.
Great. So let's go to Ken now with a question.
Yeah, thanks. So I forgot to mention last time, I'm representing Empower New Jersey. I'm not here as a individual resident. Couple of questions. So one, how does the Science Committee come to consensus? Too many of these types of boards or whatever seem to rule by a majority where one person could make the difference. And I think a lot of these questions are so important that you need something like a super majority. And then how does this all get enforced? And I think you answered that question about, but our experience with the DEP has been that they take comments today, but they're not required to listen or to act on them. It's not clear how they would be forced to demonstrate that their actions meet objectives. We've met with them, we've challenged their science, and they didn't have great answers, but nothing changed. I'm all in favor of transparency and public input. I think it's great, but sometimes input by residents basically gets the input from a few basically populist types of positions. Their passions can be more powerful than data. And so I think the public needs to be educated because most people aren't going to be able to comment intelligently on any of this stuff. And so is there an education component associated with this that could be used to basically teach people some of the science and some of the issues, and then they could make much more intelligent comments?
Well, it's a good point, Ken. And my experience has been the more people are invited to engage in the process and participate in the process, and the more scientists are willing and able to communicate the points that they seek to make in terms of the principles they're advocating for, the better the process goes. It doesn't mean everyone always agrees on the outcomes. And I referenced the podcast about timber wars. It was called Timber Wars because there wasn't a lot of agreement on the outcomes. But in the end, we agreed on a way to move forward that protected natural resources and avoided litigation, and the economy's transformation from a timber economy to a recreation and agricultural-based economy, I think has been great. So the short answer is the only way to solve that problem is to get people in a room and have a conversation, share ideas, debate, and discuss what they think works and what doesn't, and then hold the agencies accountable for implementing things that best reflects the consensus that exists. I mean, in the end, there's always the potential to use litigation to challenge something. I prefer that not be the outcome, but I've probably been sued more than any of you on this call, I can assure you. And litigation often comes to settlement and agreement on a set of principles. That's the last resort in any process. So I think it's about getting people together, sharing information, having a discussion and debate about the points that are made. And I would say that the sessions we've had about forestry that have been put together by this group, I think have been very informative, particularly as the transformation to afforestation begins to occur. There's not a consensus on a lot of these things, but it doesn't mean we can't try to apply them and monitor their performance and make adjustments, as we need to over time. That's how I would deal with it.
Yeah. Well, DEP at times has been totally unresponsive to us. We've sent them letters after letter after letter. They won't even respond. And so that needs to be fixed before I would even think of supporting something like this. And then my original question was, how does the Science Committee come to consensus? Is that going to be a majority vote, or is that going to be something like a 2/3 supermajority?
Well, to be honest, I've never been in a situation where a Science Committee had to debate and have such different outcomes that they couldn't agree on a path forward. They, people moderate their views, they get informed about issues. They may or may not agree totally, but they provide a foundation for managers to make sound decisions and benefit from the input, and the different perspectives it brings to the table. That's how I suggest you use science. Science isn't the final determinant. Science is a critical input into a public process.
Yeah, I'm not in concert with that. I like the theory. I don't think it works all the time, and I don't think it would work here. But
well, we'll have to compare experiences sometime, Ken.
Yeah. Jim, is it fair to say that this is similar to, in some respects, kind of the framework around national forests, and in particular, like the piece, what you noted about the potential for litigation, right? I mean, part of it is that you have to have a clear mandate to the agency to, develop plans based on sound science and public input. And then if there are actions taken by the agency, then that are inconsistent with those plans, and that, that creates a mechanism for the public to challenge those decisions in a way that, to Ken's point about being frustrated, I don't think there's necessarily that same mechanism right now available. I mean, so my clarifying question is, does this process that you envision strengthen and enable the ability of citizens to legally challenge actions by an agency if they deem them to be inconsistent, arbitrary, right, in relation to the plans that result from this kind of process?
Actually, what I propose, Tom, is that there be two steps, that there be an appeals process. So the public could appeal a decision by a forest manager or by an agency with regard to management of natural resources. And then, if through the appeals process, the issue can't be resolved, then litigation is a final option.
So all this basically means this has to be regulated, which is today not regulated.
In the technical term of regulated, I guess you're creating regulations for a process, yeah. Now, I sense you mean something else by regulated, but yeah, I think it's important to spell out what the process is, have it be formalized in regulations, and ensure that people follow that process. The public understands it. The public is involved in creating that process, and as well as the people in the agencies, and use that as a basis then to agree to work together and to move forward to try to make decisions. That's right.
Including transparency on the science. What was the science?
Absolutely.
What was the decision? How did they arrive at that decision? How do they support their decisions? Yeah, all those things.
Absolutely.
Okay, let's keep going. So Sylvia is up next here. Clarifying questions.
Yes, one of the questions I have, Jim, first of all, I like the idea of a forest conservation plan. I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit on if your proposal includes timber harvest removal.
Well, let me make this one point and then I'll respond directly to your question. Whatever we call it, it should be a plan that spells out both the conditions of the resource, the issues or concerns that need to be addressed, and that should be a function of public dialogue and input in the process. And then it should lay out the specific management actions that would be implemented by the agency on that forest to try to address those conditions and achieve the outcomes that through public participation people have agreed should be reflected in the final forest plan and in the condition of the resource, obviously, when that plan is implemented.
So if what I'm hearing is, if it was appropriate for the plan, you would recommend timber harvest removal. Is that what you're saying?
I'm not making any recommendation. I'm saying that is a decision to be made at a local level by the public that is involved in that forest management or planning process.
Okay, and so while I appreciate that, it's already been expressed before, the public typically is involved in FSPs that have been done. For example, on Sparta Mountain, our group has been very intimately involved. Unfortunately, the feedback that has been given doesn't always take into consideration the activities. And so I have a huge concern. And so with this thought of having the public involvement, there has to be some kind of legal challenge. The public, I feel, needs to be able to defend our natural resources. And because these are our public lands, our public lands deserve to be at the highest standards. So I would like to see if there was some sort of addendum to this that, you know, if the values of the public are not being implemented, like we're seeing on Sparta Mountain, for example, that the public have the right to sue the state. And so I think that's something that should be added to this proposal. And with the proposal of also saying that timber harvest removal, you know, leave the wood on the ground. You know, you don't have to create.
Sylvia, on that issue, there are
Mhm.
proposals related to that that are going to be discussed separately. So I think we got to keep that
Okay.
off the
Oh,
table
sure.
for the moment.
Sure. I mean, my answer to you, Sylvia, is, as I said earlier, there should be an appeals process, and there should be the right or the capacity to litigate should people feel that they need to in responding to a particular forest plan. I don't see any problem with that.
Okay, thank you.
So Jim, are you willing? I mean, I think that's in there to some degree, but are you, to Sylvia's question, are you comfortable making that explicit in your proposal as part of?
Sure, if that's necessary, I think it's it's a normal part of you know, of public discourse. People will disagree on things, and if there's a need to you know, either try to resolve it through an appeals process, if not to move forward and do so through litigation. And
Okay. Great, thank you, Sylvia. Christine Pepper. Chris.
Can you hear me? Hi.
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
We
Okay.
can.
I just thank you so much, Jim. I guess my first question is, would you be willing to be in charge of the process? And my second question, that goes on, that would be very helpful, I think. And I'm just confused about the process of the public input. Would there be a draft forest conservation plan for each of the state forests, and then public input, or first public input, then drafts, then back to the public? And how does this relate to the purpose of this task force? I mean, I thought we would be sending to Representative Smith, consensus on what to do, what's best for the forest. First, defining what forest health is, what's the best way to treat the forests for mediating climate change. I mean, does that still happen? Or could you just talk about the process?
I think Tom, I didn't mean to interrupt you. I'm sorry. I think Tom should answer that larger question of, what goes to Senator Smith. I'd suggest this for a process. Let's take Sparta Mountain as an example. The foresters there think that there's a need to engage in some sort of management action. Let's say it's harvesting timber. They should not begin that process before they have a public dialogue and public meetings and see what the response is, and present the science as they know it, or listen to the input from other scientists who might have different points of view about what should happen. They should weigh that in making judgments about how to move forward with their management actions. And whatever they propose should then again be open to public comment and public review and scientific review. And then based upon that, they should make a final decision with regard to the management actions that they want to undertake. And if there's public objection or concern to that, then and the public has exhausted their appeals process, then they should have the right to litigate.
Right. And I think, Chris, again, just that, all of these different proposals are going to build upon each other. I don't think there's just one simple recommendation or action that is going to come out of this process. It's, it's going to require a variety of measures and steps to kind of deal with our goals. I think so. Try not to view this as, this not as the be all and end all, but a piece of the puzzle. And those pieces will hopefully begin to fit together as we go forward. So. Wilma? Can we unmute Wilma Fry? Wilma, it looks like you're still muted.
She is.
Has she been unmuted on our end? I assume she has, so the problem might be on her end. Wilma, you could put something in the chat, or you could call in and ask your question by telephone if that's easier for you. So in the meantime, let's go to Elliot Ruga, please.
Hey, Jim, Elliot Ruga, New Jersey Highlands Coalition. The more I think about the question I'm about to ask you, I'm thinking maybe every proposal should answer this question as part of the process. Can you characterize what you think is the problem that you want to address by this proposal that's happening in New Jersey?
Well, I see a lot of conflict over how public lands, in particular forests in this case, are being managed. And what I'm advocating for is A, to be recognition of the diverse values of those forests, B, that the agencies recognize that they're public forests and public lands, and the public has every right to have input into and comment on and hopefully influence what kind of management plans occur, and see that we can manage these resources for future generations, recognizing all their values, and that those be incorporated into the decisions that are made, by the state, by individual forest managers, and hopefully by the partners who are helping to build those plans.
I managed to unmute.
Okay,
Elliot,
great. Well,
you hear me?
Elliot, I think.
I just, I think it's getting down to a very central issue that we're struggling with here. And if we can come to some sort of consensus on that, we can probably all go home. And that is, should we continue to harvest timber in our public lands? I think that's the question we keep avoiding. But
well, to give you an honest answer, Elliot, because I've dealt with that issue for decades. In the Pacific Northwest, timber ruled, and then we discovered that those forests had, and we're talking decades now, so this is established science today, but those forests had important value for threatened and endangered species. The lead on that was the spotted owl. They were critical watersheds for the reproduction of salmon, and we needed to recognize that. And those values were of such significance that we needed to completely change how we manage those forests and really limit the amount of timber harvesting that occurred. So that conversation continues on and on and on. But I think, the transformation that I'm advocating for is the public be involved from the outset, the public be a part of the management process and oversight. That sounds science, and there's, to the conversation I had earlier with Ken, scientists don't always agree on everything. There's nothing perfect about the science process either, but the best science we have, sound public input, and responsive and responsible forest managers who understand their job is to be the stewards of the public's forests, using the best science and reflecting that kind of public input. That's a process that can work, and I've seen it work because I've worked hard to make it work at the federal level. And it's interesting to come home to New Jersey and see how much conflict there is over forests and forest management. And at least I think some of the elements of the process I described in the experience I had could be helpful in resolving some of the conflict. That's not to say there isn't conflict over the stewardship of national forests today, but it's a lot less than it used to be. And clearly, because of the science, we're seeing how invaluable forests are for addressing some of the most important threats of our generation and future generations, like climate change, like the loss of biodiversity, and the maintenance of the ecological integrity of these resources. So hopefully that all comes together to allow reasonable people to come to the reasonable conclusion that they need to work together, for the betterment of the resource. And sometimes that might involve timber harvesting. I've certainly seen that as an important element in reducing fire risk to communities, but it's not the be all and end all in all cases, not at all.
It's a good conversation that we're having. Thank you.
Let's go back to Wilma. Thanks, Elliot. Let's go back to Wilma if you're able to ask your question.
I was actually going, I'm sorry, now there's a reverberation and I don't know how to get rid of it.
We can hear you, Wilma. Go ahead.
Okay, I just was recalling back when the Forest Service, Federal Forest Service had the rare roadless area review and evaluation, which basically asks the public to go out and identify potential roadless areas on the U.S. forest.
Right.
And I think that was a great effort. And it involved a lot of people. People do a lot of volunteering on that. And a number, not all of the proposed areas, but some of them actually were put into legislation.
That's right. And I was very much involved in that, Wilma, and went through many ugly hearings with the Republican Congress over that issue. But I think we discovered, how valuable those intact landscapes were. And as a result, we put in place, Mike Dombeck and I put in place a process to protect roadless lands. And now we're seeing in the context of climate change, how important natural climate solutions, i.e. protecting intact forests and other natural resources are to tackling the threat of climate change. So that's the way I think the process should work.
Great, thank you. Let's go to Larry again. Clarifying questions, looking at the clock here, we're approaching 5:45 and we're not through 2 proposals, let alone 4. So clarifying questions only, please. Larry? If your audio is out, we'll look for your text. There's really been no conflict in New Jersey. A very few very recently tried to change how things were done once they found they could bring in lots of funds to. Okay, I'm not going to get into any attacks. I'm looking for a question here, Larry. All right, it's a comment, it's not a question, so I'm going to move on. Vin.
So thanks, Jim. I think I like your proposal and all. I would ask the co-chairs, I think it might be lucrative to ask the DEP about their process of these things. Because from my experience, we already go through this very similar process in the 14-step process for public lands, wherein they might say they hire me to write a plan. There's an internal and an external stakeholder review for my inventory, from which once that inventory is approved by the internal and external folks, then I can write management objectives. Then it goes to an internal and external stakeholder process. Then I get to write the actual rationale for those management objectives. Then it goes to the internal, external, plus the public to review the overall plan. Once they approve of that, then I can submit it to whomever else. So if I'm going to the Pinelands, it would go through their process as well, which would go back to the public one more time before it finally comes back and it's finally edited and can be approved. So it's kind of, you're recommending, like, I'm not opposed to that process. I agree, like, public should definitely be involved, but I just wonder, it's already kind of in place.
Well, let me just suggest this. To some degree, perhaps it is, but the difference in the process I described is before anybody decides to put pen to paper or to lay out what they think the management objectives for a given forest should be, there should be, an opportunity for the public to comment. In fact, there should be a partnership with the public, so the public is involved in helping to define outcomes and management objectives and help the agency to understand the values they want to see preserved in management of those forests. With that, if there's a need to, make a change in the forest plan, either because of a legislative requirement, they do it every 10 to 15 years, which is the federal requirement, or because some condition has changed, fires impact the area, or insect and disease is having an impact, or recreation demand has grown and there's a need to address that. That partnership should work together to begin to lay out what management options exist before anybody starts to build a plan. And if I understood what you said, basically, the Forest Service in this case in New Jersey begins the planning process, you're involved, and then the public has an opportunity for input later. Those relationships have to exist from the start.
And I would also ask, just again, clarify, so Vin, this is something that does occur, but am I correct that it's not a requirement for all public forest lands? So if they are going to do a plan, they have to follow this process, but it's not a requirement that it be done for all forest lands. Can we unmute Vin?
I was suggesting that we reach out to DEP to clarify that, because as I understand it, this process is what the DEP follows.
Right, but you see, my question is, are they required to do it and follow it for all forest lands? Or is it a matter of if they do a plan, this is the process they must follow? There's a difference. I think what Jim is suggesting is a comprehensive requirement and process for all state forest lands, followed by forested areas of state parks, which is different from if the DEP is going to do a plan, they must follow such a process, right?
And to be clear, Tom, I think given the fact that this task force exists, and given the controversy that I'm aware of, as having moved back to New Jersey over forest management, I think it's time to start a fresh process and do plans for all the state forests. I would advocate for parks that have substantial forest, or maybe they should be park plans that encompass not just forest but other lands, and encourage public participation and debate about what the future of those landscapes should look like, and then based upon that, develop plans with opportunities for public feedback and comment before they're implemented. I think that's a way to kind of bring a focus to this, and also to perfect the process. There'll be holes in the process. There'll be challenges in implementing it. There may be challenges getting the funding, to make it work. But I think the key is that, this conflict and controversy and concerns about different management activities and what should and shouldn't happen on the forest, that should be a discussion that occurs, at the local level, and should reflect both public input and professional input.
Right. Okay, so I want to go to people who have not had a chance to ask a question yet. So I'm going to go to Mary Shaw.
Hi, my question has to do with how do we hold the New Jersey DEP responsible? Is that part of Mr. Lyons' proposal here, or will that be handled somewhere else?
Well, explain to me, I guess implied in that is that you reach the end of a process and they don't comply, or they don't do something that you or somebody in the public doesn't want. I want to be clear about
right.
I'm
talking about the end of the process, because I think that my limited experience with governmental agencies holding hearings is you can talk to your blue in the face and make all the proposals you want, and they can go about their day and disregard that. But if we get through that and get along with your process, where there's public input from the beginning, more or less, at the end, if we come up with something that, oh, hey, they don't really like, so all of a sudden they can't find the funds for it or the manpower or something like that. Is there something in your proposal, or maybe it'll be handled in another proposal, as to how we hold them in compliance? I mean, can we do regulation or without going to lawsuits, or what are options?
Jim, I could jump in there. I mean, I think, as we mentioned at the outset, we have a subgroup actively looking at the state of regulations related to, timber management on our public forest lands, and whether additional regulations are needed. So that's going to be dealt with separately. And I think, Jim, we already clarified that part of his vision was that there would be a clear legislatively mandated appeals process and opportunity related to these plans, and then following that appeals process, the ability for the public to litigate over decisions that the agency might take if they were deemed by the public to be inconsistent with the, with the plans and arbitrary and capricious. So.
And that would include non-action on recommended plans then.
You mean
Or
the failure of the
inaction.
agency to move forward?
Yes.
I would say yes, except I would offer this caveat because I run into it all the time. They don't get the funding to be able to do what they've committed to do. Then you've got to deal with legislators, appropriators, the budget office, et cetera. That's one of those conundrums that's sometimes difficult to deal with. But I mean, my assumption is if you're going to move forward with a plan and develop a plan and commit to implement the plan, then you also have to go to the budget office or go to the DEP commissioner and say, we need the money to make this happen.
Very good.
Okay, let's go to Leslie. Let's try to everybody be as quick as possible because we're running up against the clock and we're going to need to wrap this up shortly after 6.
Me? I will try
Go
to
ahead,
be,
Leslie, please. Thank you.
I will try to be very quick. I guess my single question is, while I can support all of this kind of planning and all of this even documentation, I think it's important to recognize that we already established the purpose of these public forests. They hadn't been logged for 60 years because we were engaged in protection. We were actually doing pro-forestation before we even knew what the word was. We found out you have to do more than that. You have to deal with deer, but I don't think we have to start over and ask whether these forests were preserved for protection purposes. I think the goal is, how do we address these issues of management without actually production? I wrote a book on restoration. I know no activity that requires you to remove the wood to be effective. I think we need a moratorium, and why do we need that?
So let me
deal with all those
respond to
issues
that.
separately.
Let me just say, Tom, that in my mind, a management objective of not harvesting, leaving the forest alone is an acceptable objective. That's a management prescription that applies to many forests in New Jersey, and there's nothing wrong with that.
Yep. Thank you. Yep. I think public forest is where that's at.
Great. Let's go to Will Price, please.
Hi, how you doing? Thanks, and I'm definitely supportive of this and Jacqueline's proposal and commend both of them for how it's framed. I'm also just hearing the discussion, but just sort of knowing that there's a lot in place that's already done and maybe unsuccessfully or maybe not followed up on in some cases, but just I think it'd be helpful with this to recognizing that there's already a process for planning, referencing the intersection with existing planning and consultation requirements, but also the specific language on the stages at which appeals and litigation. We've talked an awful lot about that, and on what grounds, and being clear about how that interfaces with the science committee, because, and I think, Jim, you spoke to this sort of maybe the public input and the public information, the public interface happens earlier and includes some of the science outputs and what this, but where does that fit with, to what extent is that embedded in the required process, and is there litigation there, right? Is it litigation about, failures of process or use of old science, or
let me respond to that. I mean, I would simply say this, that before anybody puts pen to paper with regard to any forest management plan, there needs to be, an inventory and an analysis of the condition of the forest. There needs to be the scientific input, given that information, to understand, condition, opportunities for management, what the science would recommend if science had a brain, and extensive meetings with the public to understand how the public views that forest and what outcomes they want. That should be the basis for writing a forest plan.
Yeah. No, thanks. And I mean, I think in general with this process and having listened to the calls, I do feel like this is an opportunity to fundamentally recast the purpose and the process for planning on public lands in light of maintaining rich and resilient forest ecosystems and sequester more carbon. Most public and private forests around the country, national forests included, don't have plans that adequately address climate. I mean, probably following the Willamette National Forest, plan that just came out, it's being disputed, and I think also an important point that maybe speaks to some of the harvest concerns. I'll be quick. Is that there are just many stands at even forest types for which current conditions are dire enough ecologically that more carbon will be released or need to be removed in order for stocks, habitat, and species to be stable over the long term. So, and we don't even know this for the 11 forests in the states.
I couldn't agree more.
Yeah.
And I'll just first of all, I'm involved in with Norm Johnson and Jerry Franklin and looking at what's happening to Willamette. But I think the other problem is that we do need to understand, given what we now know about climate change, the threats to biodiversity now recognized globally, et cetera, that these forests may have a higher and better purpose to address those concerns. And that should be built into the process as we look at the future of the forest. Certainly in New Jersey, that becomes a critical issue, as watershed health is always going to be a critical issue. But this is a critical connecting corridor for wildlife between New England and the southeastern states. Those are variables that need to be considered as we look at the management of these landscapes.
Well,
okay,
so I'll just leave it. Oh, did I get muted? Okay, no, just real quickly, I would agree with, I like the proposal, especially the component of the science outputs and discussion being for public consumption and discussion, because that's a huge opportunity to really absorb the climate stakes for these state forests. So that's all I wanted to share.
Okay, thank you, Will. All right, everybody. So it's a couple minutes after 6. We're still in clarifying questions. Before we end this meeting today, I want to call the question as to where we are in this proposal. So we've not heard from John, Paul, or Sandra. There's people who have their hands up who have already asked a question. In the interest of time, we're not going to go back to you for another one, sorry. But John, Paul, Sandra, are there clarifying questions that you simply must ask before we move to whether this is something that we've got consensus on or not? If you must have that question asked, leave your hand up. If it's not critical to calling the question as to whether we have consensus on this, then I'd ask you to consider putting your hand down. Okay, John, go for it.
That's right. It's very quick. It's a scale sort of question because we sort of talk micro and macro. If you considered maybe doing this at a more aggregated level, like master plan for Pinelands forests, master plan for Highlands forests, then the individual forest plans would need to be designed against the master plan objectives. But to find the objectives at the regional level, then do individual forest plans that match those master plan objectives. That's my only question.
Well, in a quick response, I mean, I think that makes a lot of sense. I believe in managing at a landscape level. So you might look at watersheds, you might look at, ecological units or defined areas based on ecological conditions. Sure, I think that makes a lot of sense because these forests they don't exist in isolation. They affect in many respects interact with each other. So that's a logical way to look at this. It's also I would hope for the state a cost-efficient way to look at forest management objectives. In a collective way, it should enhance public participation and input. Provide greater benefit from science and hopefully more opportunity for a broader public to comment.
So I don't know, Jim, whether that's something, do we tweak the proposal to suggest that plans be required? They could either be for the specific state forest, or they could be organized some other ecological,
I guess what I would suggest, Tom, is that, we focus on individual plans, but recognize the opportunity to work at this larger geographic area, depending on conditions and kind of common characteristics of the forest and the efficiencies that may come of that. So it's, it's certainly an option to consider. It's one, I think I'd like to know more about the resources that are available to the State Forest Service to see if they wouldn't see it as valuable because of some of the limits that they face.
Right. Okay, let's go to Sandra, and then Paul, is that a new hand or? Okay, go to Sandra.
Yes, just one question. Jim, when you followed this process at the federal level, was it followed because in the professional judgment of the people in charge, this was the way to do it, or because some federal law required you to use this kind of public process? Thank you.
There was a law called the National Forest Management Act that was passed in 1976, and it required a planning process. But when I was in office, I pulled together a group of scientists to look at that process and reframe it. And they produced a rather voluminous report that redefined forest management and forest planning. And that actually, that was then the foundation for developing a much more coordinated and collaborative approach to forest planning, actually involving the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the Park Service, the Bureau of Land Management, to work on a large landscape basis. But as that was getting ready to move forward, there was an election in 2000, and the Bush people killed it. Honest truth. I don't know if that answers your question or not, but I think there's value in looking at this in that context, and and the value of having broad scientific input and public input is a part of that process.
Thank you.
So we're going to go last question to Paul before we call the question on this proposal.
Yeah, my hand did go up and down because I wasn't sure about this, but I do need some clarification on it. A lot of the emphasis of your presentation was on public participation and starting at an early stage, which I generally agree with. But lately I've been a little bit cynical about some of the results of public processes. And that might be a heretical viewpoint, but I need to express it. So I was wondering if the plan includes any protections against some outrageous thing like a public force coming in and saying, we would rather like cut the state forest down and put up a baseball stadium. Would these on land that's already protected, is there like some kind of limitation that you can't go beyond and cause like a severe amount of damage?
Well, that's a hard question to answer because there is a legal framework, of course, that probably would influence or determine how that public process could be implemented. I mean, I would say this: one would hope that the judgment of managers and their understanding of the interests of the constituency they know from that forest would be respected, if you will, in lieu of something as bold and brash as, well, we want to cut down this and build a baseball stadium. I don't know what the legal protections are against something like that, but my experience in New Jersey, when people care dearly about something, they show up in droves and they make their voices heard, as reflected by this task force. And I would count on that. All I'm saying is, let's be very clear. These forests are owned by New Jerseyans, and their views, their values, their goals for these forests need to be reflected in how their lands are managed.
Great, thanks, Jim. And again, I think this is where there's other proposals that are, already been submitted that could layer on additional protections, right? I mean, we've got proposals related to establishing ecological reserves in areas that are, legislatively protected and off limits from all kinds of activities other than, what's necessary to sort of maintain the health of the ecosystem. So there's other things here that could layer on top, the regulatory protections, other types of, designations and protections that we'll be discussing that can be layered on top of this planning process. It's not all the eggs are not in this basket, but it's kind of establishes a strong foundation that's based on science and that's based on public input and participation. I think that's kind of and that's what the two proposals we discussed together, I think, really are all about. So, all right. So with that, it's 10 after 6. Seems like most people are hanging in there. We've lost a few people. We should call the question on this one. I'm going to assume Wilma's hand is a legacy hand, as we're calling it. So at this point, based on the proposal as we discussed it, as described by Jim, as written in his proposal, I think with the caveat that we wanted, there was a request for a little more explicit mention of the public appeal process and the ability to litigate. Jim sound, perfectly fine with just clarifying that in the written proposal. The other issue I wrote down was just, the being open to the potential for other kind of landscape level watershed planning, as opposed to strictly looking at the boundaries of the public forest. Those were the two sort of caveats that I think were discussed. With those caveats, is there anyone that objects to this proposal such that they can't live with it? So I see two hands. I see Jean and Ken. So Jean, why don't you go first?
Can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
I just want to say, even though I'm an individual now, I spent my career listening to public input and processing it, and that's it. There already is many of these public input required by the regulations every time the state proposes to do an action, and that's it.
Okay, thanks, Jean. So you think it's not necessary? Got it. Ken.
Yeah, so there's a lot to like here. I'm going to oppose it. I'm not satisfied with the process for the science committee to come to consensus. The DEP takes comments today and they just go about their business. Bill Zipse's making forest policy based on his desire to not import wood from Africa. And so this has got to be stopped. And I think there needs to be more education. There needs to be an education component built into this so that you get, intelligent input from the public who may not really understand a lot of this. And I agree with public input, and I agree with transparency, but it doesn't necessarily work unless the public really understands what's going on here. And the last thing is what I'd like to see in the last aspect that we discussed about the public having the right to appeal and then sue the DEP is that while those are underway, that the DEP does not move forward with implementing any of its recommended activities. That while those legal actions are being pursued, nothing can happen on the ground.
Right. Well, in the courts, there's always the ability to seek an injunction, which the court may or may not grant. But anyway.
You can always,
it's a lot easier if it's written into the rule to begin with.
Yeah, let me point out one more time, you mentioned an individual public employee. We will not do that in this task force. Please refrain from aligning public servants or any individual. The organization is one thing, but no individuals. Thanks.
Well, I agree with, yes, and I'm sorry if it was a maligning statement, but you did bring him in to present, and that's what he said.
Okay, let's keep moving because we're 6:15 here. I want to note any concerns. Sarah, please.
Sarah Webb, retired forest ecologist at your university, former environmental planner, and I've got forestry training. I'm not comfortable with this because I don't think we need a new planning process. I don't think that's going to fix much. I think the decision-making about policy is what this body has gathered to put together. And that's our mandate, a policy about how we're going to handle our forests in an age of climate change. Whichever way the wind blows, we know we have strong opinions on both sides about whether we should keep logging our mature conservation forests. I'm not going to talk about that. I know we don't have any time, but the reason I'm hesitant is I think Vin is correct. We have processes already at the DEP for public input, and I've been very involved with that, as have many of you, and it's not changing what's happening on the ground. So I think that we just need to focus on the mandate to develop legislation, policies here as a body. This is the group of diverse people coming together to work it out. So that's why I'm not in favor of this proposal. It's a nice one, but I don't think it's the way to go.
Okay, thanks, Sarah. Margaret?
I agree with everything Ken Dolsky said and Sarah Webb. NJFTF ignores what the public has to say, even if they present it with science. They've already made a decision before they even attend the public hearings. And I believe that this task force was purposed with the task of deciding what to do with our forests. And by just redeciding to have someone else do it, you're taking that task away from us. Thank you.
Okay, well, again, I would just reiterate that we're not viewing this proposal in isolation. There's 50 plus other proposals still to be discussed that deal with all sorts of other aspects of what this task force might have to say about the management of our public forest lands. I would say, Chris, did you make a comment? Can we unmute Chris?
Hello. I really didn't want to talk. I just wanted to get my hand up. I love this proposal, but it's hard. I'm having trouble with this task force process. I don't know whether to accept this if there's not other protections in place. You know, we haven't gotten to the other proposals yet. The proposals about keeping wood in the forest. So I don't know how to approve, you know, I would approve this like contingent, almost comes later. So I would hope what we're doing now, I don't really understand how final it is. So I don't know if our approval, how important it is now. So, you know, I feel like it's hard to approve anything really without getting those other questions settled.
Yeah, that's fair. I understand, Chris. It's hard because we are sort of dealing with this piecemeal proposal by proposal, and you don't know what's going to come out of the discussion on the other proposals and how you feel about one proposal may be impacted by others. So that's a fair concern. I mean, that's something the co-chairs can think about and talk about. There is no perfect process, but for the moment, I think we're trying to deal with these proposal by proposal, knowing that they're going to build upon each other, and we don't know at the end of the day yet where everything's going to shake out on the different proposals, and there's some uncertainty associated with that. So that's a fair concern. I mean, to me, again, Eileen, my view is that I think this is a consensus item. I know we've got some concerns. You know, we can document those concerns. Some primarily about, you know, whether this is necessary, whether we can trust, whether this would change anything at DEP. We need more education. So I think we can document those, but again, we've got a lot of people who are quiet here. If you're quiet, it means you don't have concerns. I sort of feel like I feel comfortable calling this a consensus item, documenting those concerns, if you do.
Yeah, I would as well. I think that a lot of the issues, these good issues that were brought up are going to be covered. And, you know, we have the advantage of seeing a lot of the proposals coming in. They are kind of naturally forming into groups, and you'll probably see it'll be less piecemeal moving forward. And these issues that are being brought up will be discussed. And, you know, when this issue is written up into the overall narrative, I think we will have those missing pieces. So for now, I think this process, this planning process, I hear people like it. It's just some people feel it's redundant, and others would like to see those safeguards again that we've heard before. And I think we're going to cover those issues in future discussions.
Yeah, so on that note, I would say we let's wrap it up at 6:20. People have already gone 20 minutes over our 2 hour, and we're getting into dinner time. Paul, please email whatever your question or comment is, please email to the task force. We will read it, we will respond. We are due to reconvene on August 15th and 16th. The 16th will be the ecological work group. Vin, I'm sorry we didn't get to your proposal. We will definitely put you on for the 16th. Hopefully you're available. I think your proposal builds upon these proposals because it is about planning, but then it starts to get into this concept of kind of different forest zones, right? Which I'm sure there'll be a lot to talk about related to that. So it layers in some additional sort of detail around the planning process. And what was the other, Sandra Chen? Sorry, we didn't get to Sandra's proposal either. So it's taking longer, and we might need to just start planning these meetings, to be 2.5 hours or maybe 3 hours, because, it's taking us a long time to get through one proposal. My hope was we would do 4 and we did 2 in 2
Well, you know what, Tom, I think there's going to be groups of proposals discussed together.
Yeah.
I think we have some topical ones, so I'm hopeful, I'm optimistic.
Okay. So, and in the meantime, the subgroup on regulations, my hope is going to meet prior to the 15th and the 16th. So there will be activity happening on that issue prior to the 15th and 16th. On the 15th, the climate group is going to be discussing a bunch of proposals related to proforestation. Eileen and I will talk about a logical grouping of proposals to tee up on the 16th, including what we already have carrying over from this one. So thank you all really for the time. Great, thoughtful, respectful conversation. Everybody be well, and we'll be talking more soon.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you, Jim, and thank you, Jacqueline, in particular.